Hi everyone, my name is ByKateFarley. I'm coming to you from Green Bay, Wisconsin. For my domain, for my descriptive schema project, I chose quick bread recipes. And this descriptive schema can be used to provide impatient novice bakers with recipes for quick breads. And that was really important to me because I'm one of those impatient novice bakers who really likes bread. So just a couple of quick definitions. Based on the feedback that I got from the discussion board, I did change a couple of things, so I'll just kind of gloss over the things that I didn't really change. The quick bread definition: quick breads are baked goods that are more dense than leavened breads. So leavened breads are made with yeast or eggs, which are natural rising agents. Quick breads are more dense and they only proof or rise once while they're baking. So the general baking instructions for quick breads are to combine the dry ingredients, then combine the wet ingredients, so that's usually 2 separate bowls. Then you combine the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients, and then you grease the pan or the stone, and you drop the batter into the pan or onto the stone, and then you bake it. And then while it's baking, the quick bread is rising. So quick breads also have chemical rising agents like baking powder or baking soda, whereas leavened breads have natural rising agents like yeast or eggs. Leavened breads like ciabatta have a lot of structure, whereas cornbread, which is a quick bread, doesn't. So leavened breads also take a lot longer because first you need to wait for the yeast to bloom, and then once the ingredients are mixed together, the dough has to rise once more. Then once the dough doubles in size, the baker must knead the dough to form the shape, and then you wait for it to rise one more time, and then you actually bake the bread where it rises a third time. So you can see how this takes quite a bit of time, so that's why the impatient part of my domain is really kind of the key factor here. And then one of the things that I incorporated later into my values and attributes was total baking time. That wasn't something that I had before. Comparatively, unleavened breads take a lot less time to make, and they have kind of a similar process like quick breads when you're doing the ingredients incorporation. Unleavened breads, some examples of those are tortillas, roti, lefse, matzo, and those don't have rising agents like I said, so the dough doesn't have air bubbles that would make it rise. So really quickly, I'll just go over my target audience. So they're kind of the same people like me. They lose patience while they're waiting for their bread to bake, and they end up rushing their dough, and then they get something that's really dense and not super great. So I've collected some of these recipes that don't take too much time. They only proof once rather than 3 times. And with these recipes or written instructions, they will help novice, impatient bakers execute recipes for quick breads. The scope of my collection includes both physical recipe cards, cookbooks, and online links, although all of my examples I pulled from online just because they were my favorite recipes for these specific kinds of quick breads. Again, I'll go over the scope a little bit. The recipes will be exclusively for quick bread recipes. They contain chemical rising agents like baking powder or baking soda, beer, or yogurt, and they require only 1 proof to be a finished recipe. So leavened breads are not part of this recipe because they contain yeast or eggs, so those are natural rising ingredients. And then those bread types require a 2nd or even 3rd proof sometimes to build up the gluten and then form the bubbles in the dough. So another omission from my scope is leavened breads because they don't contain rising agents. And a way that you can identify whether or not a dough recipe is for a quick bread or not is whether or not the dough recipe contains chemical rising agents, then it can be considered a quick bread. Some traditional unleavened breads can add chemical rising agents to change the texture of the dough, so it'll make it a little softer and more pliable. So some tortilla recipes will add baking powder to make the dough kind of puffy and pliable. So that actually would be a version of a tortilla quick bread. So that's how you can kind of identify how to find a quick bread recipe. I did change a few of my attributes based on the feedback from Dr. Choi. So I have specified that for the title of the recipe, users should list the name of the recipe from the website, the cookbook, or the recipe card. For the source, I've listed an order of importance so that users can discriminate between what they need to find versus what is kind of lower priority. Users should list the first and last name of the author or the pseudonym first, then the cookbook title or the website title if the recipe has all three. So all of those things should be included, but if the recipe doesn't have all of the elements, then you can just list the ones that are there. This is one of the attributes and values that I did change. Before I had country of origin, and I didn't think it was consistent enough to be an attribute. I changed it to total time, and it kind of helps with the ethos of my domain too, because I'm targeting impatient novice bakers. So they're probably going to be looking at the time factor in this a little bit more closely than other things within the attributes and values tables. So total time, I specified number of minutes, including the preparation time, as that is another attribute that I've listed here. Number of bowls is something that I normally look at because I also don't want to have to do that many dishes. So you list the bowls as a number. The pan size was something that I had to deal with as I was coming up with my tables for my recipes. So I had to specify length, width, or height and depth of the pan. And some of my recipes actually don't use a pan, but they do use a stone. So I did have to grapple with that issue while I was creating my presentation for today. Number of ingredients, that's pretty self-explanatory, but I've specified to list the number of ingredients as a number. And then we're also going to list the ingredients from the recipe card or from the website where you're getting your recipe from. And then I also wanted to make sure that front and center were the leavening agents that were included in the recipe. So if you found that there was yeast, this might be an indication that it could potentially be a leavened bread, because you normally will have to wait for yeast to bloom in order for the bread to rise. Some recipes for quick breads will still use yeast, they just won't wait for it to rise. I think it's more for the flavor. So that's why I've specifically highlighted the leavening agents from the list of ingredients, because I wanted to point out that that could be an indicator of something that may not belong within this category. Like I said before, preparation time in minutes, that's also listed as a number. I also thought it was important to identify the yield or the serving size. So how many bakes are you making? How many loaves, muffins, cakes, or servings? I also think I really like knowing what the flavor of something is, and if it can vary, I like to know that too, because you can substitute. So I've added flavor here as one of my attributes, and the values are savory, sweet, bitter. The decoration was something I kind of had a hard time with, because normally when you say decoration, you're talking about like sprinkles or frosting or something like that. But normally you would put like butter or cinnamon and sugar, or for the scones recipe that I'm going to be going over, you can add clotted cream, and that's really delicious. Another thing that I wanted to include, cooking time in minutes listed as a number. And then I also specified that for cooking temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, that should be listed as a number, and if the recipe is prepared in degrees Celsius, then you can look up the conversion table here. My final attribute and value is a link or a photo to the recipe. For my first recipe, I have scones from the King Arthur Flour website, and the total cooking time was 65 minutes. Number of bowls was 2. So it has the same process that I talked about in the beginning, where you have 2 separate bowls and you have the dry ingredients in one and then the wet ingredients in another, and then you combine the 2, and then you put the batter into the dish that you're going to be baking the quick bread with. So for the pan dimensions, I used a cookie sheet, because you mold the scones into a disc shape and then you cut them into triangles and then you pull them apart, and then you just leave them on the cookie sheet. The number of ingredients is pretty self-explanatory. The list of ingredients here is also pretty clear, although you do have to reserve some milk and sparkling white sugar for the decoration, as you can see under the decoration attribute and value. The flavor is sweet, but you can also make scones savory, so you can do like a cheese and chive or something like that. As you can see, another leavening agent here, aside from the baking powder, is eggs, and it is a natural rising agent, but since we're also using chemical rising agent and the scones only rise the one time while they're baking, this is definitely considered a quick bread. Under the decoration, I had mentioned the milk and sugar topping, but the clotted cream is another thing that you can put on scones once they've actually finished baking. My next recipe was kind of a challenge because it's considered like the ultimate quick bread because it can be made over a campfire. So it's bannocks, and it's Scottish skillet bread. And as you can see here, we have an author, and it's coming from curiouscuisinaire.com. And it's actually a pretty quick recipe. You just have to be really careful about how hot the fire is where you're baking your quick bread. So it should get up to about 400 degrees. And for the pan dimensions, I had mentioned in my earlier part of this presentation that I had a hard time coming up with the pan dimensions because some bakes aren't formed in a pan. They are placed on a sheet or on a stone. So this was one of those cases. And as you can see here, there's a variety of different ingredients that contribute to the rise in this bake. The baking powder makes it rise quicker than you would expect, so it's not just a pancake. And the texture of it is kind of like a really thick pancake, but the powdered milk also makes it rise. For the cooking temperature, I mentioned that this can be prepared over a campfire, but you have to make sure that the pan is hot enough so that when the oil in the pan, which is there to make sure that the bake doesn't stick to the pan, the oil has to be hot enough that it's sizzling but not smoking. So you have to get the pan pretty hot before you actually start to put your batter into the pan. Then the link to the recipe is right there, and you saw what a bannock looked like right before this. My next recipe is beer bread, and this recipe actually came from allrecipes.com, and there was an author associated with it, so her first and last name are there. Pan dimensions for this one is kind of like a traditional beer bread. One thing I was a little surprised about in this recipe that I had kind of forgotten was the limited amount of ingredients that were here. So beer is the rising agent, but then the self-rising flour also contributes to the rise in the bake. So self-rising flour you can just get at a grocery store, but you can make your own too. You just do all-purpose flour and then baking powder. So it's a ratio that you can balance out to make your own self-rising flour. And then everything else on here is pretty clear. My next quick bread is an Irish soda bread. And this recipe is from Ina Garten on the foodnetwork.com website. This one was the longest bake, so it's 75 minutes, and I think it's just because the prep time takes quite a long time. Like 20 minutes is a long time for a quick bread. Normally you just make a batter and then you put it in the dish that you're going to be baking it in. But there are quite a few things to do to get the bake ready. Like you have to zest an orange, you have to cut in butter into the soda bread, and then you also have to use buttermilk. So that takes a little bit if you're using powdered buttermilk. So the rising agents here were baking soda, buttermilk, egg. And then as I had mentioned, this is kind of the same process that scones go through where they form a round loaf. And you do actually have to knead this bread a little bit to get it to rise. So that was one difference in these recipes, that you had to kind of work the dough a little bit and it wasn't as battery. And the link to the recipe is there. My final recipe, I kind of wanted to challenge myself because typically sopapillas are deep fried. So I wanted to try and see how my schema would hold up in having to use a deep fryer. Instead, you can substitute using like a deeper pan on a stove, and then you can put your oil in that pan and then use that to cook them. As you can see here, this is a pretty simple dough. It is very quick, but that's because you're deep frying the dough. It's like a mini donut and they puff up. But the most time that you have to dedicate to this is actually getting the ingredients together. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe. Just kidding. So thanks for listening. I hope your schemas all went well.